March 15, 1943, U-boat control room, Lorient, France, 04:17 hours. The metallic clatter of the Enigma machine's rotors echoed through the concrete bunker as Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartmann typed his patrol coordinates into the cipher device, each keystroke producing a scrambled letter that would transform his operational orders into what he believed was an impenetrable code. The smell of salt water and diesel fuel clung to his uniform from yesterday's shore inspection of U-653, the Type 7C submarine he would command into the North Atlantic within hours. Around him, the operations room hummed with the subdued efficiency of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat headquarters, radio operators transcribing encoded messages, staff officers plotting convoy routes on massive wall charts, orderlies delivering coffee in chipped ceramic cups that bore the Reichsadler eagle. The sound that defined this moment was not the urgent chaos of combat, but rather the methodical clicking of the Enigma machine itself, a mechanical rhythm that represented Germany's absolute confidence in the mathematical impossibility of Allied forces breaking the Wehrmacht's cipher system. Hartmann watched the illuminated letters appear on the Enigma's lampboard as he typed, each keystroke triggering a cascade of electrical impulses through the machine's rotors and plugboard, transforming his plaintext message into what cryptographers had calculated was one of 159 quintillion possible combinations. The orders he was encoding directed his U-boat to a patrol zone southwest of Iceland, to a specific coordinate where German naval intelligence believed a slow Allied convoy would pass within 48 hours, vulnerable to the Wolfpack tactics that had sent millions of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic. The encoding process was routine, practiced thousands of times during his training, a bureaucratic necessity that added perhaps 15 minutes to the transmission of orders, but that guaranteed, or so every U-boat commander had been taught, that British naval intelligence would never decipher German operational plans in time to affect tactical outcomes. What Hartmann could not know, what no German military officer suspected despite 3 years of war and mounting evidence that Allied responses sometimes demonstrated uncanny prescience, was that his encoded message would be decrypted by British codebreakers at Bletchley Park within hours of transmission, that Allied naval commanders would read his patrol orders before U-653 even cleared the protective minefield surrounding Lorient, and that the convoy he had been directed to intercept would be rerouted around his position based on intelligence derived from the very Enigma cipher he trusted to protect his operational security. The clicking of the Enigma machine was not the sound of security, but rather the acoustic signature of German strategic blindness, the mechanical rhythm that announced to listeners who understood its significance that German forces were about to transmit information that Allied intelligence would exploit with devastating effectiveness. This moment, a German U-boat commander encoding orders with absolute confidence in cipher security, while Allied codebreakers prepared to read those orders almost in real time, exemplified one of World War II's most significant intelligence asymmetries and one of its most closely guarded secrets. The Allied success in breaking the Enigma cipher, achieved through a combination of Polish mathematical breakthroughs, British institutional commitment to code-breaking, and American industrial capacity to produce computing machines that automated decryption processes, provided strategic intelligence advantages that influenced virtually every major campaign from 1941 through war's end. Yet German forces, despite possessing sophisticated signals intelligence capabilities of their own, never comprehended that their most secure cipher system had been fundamentally compromised, never understood that their operational security was an illusion, maintained only by Allied discipline in concealing how they obtained intelligence, and never recognized that the tactical and operational surprises they experienced throughout the war's final years were frequently the direct result of Allied commanders reading German plans before those plans were executed. To understand the magnitude of this intelligence failure and its implications for German military operations, one must first comprehend the Enigma machine itself and the institutional confidence Germans placed in its security. The Enigma was not a single device, but rather a family of electromechanical cipher machines that the German military had adopted in various forms throughout the 1920s and 1930s, convinced that the machine's complexity created codes that could not be broken through any practical cryptanalytic method. The military version of Enigma, used by the Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, and Luftwaffe, employed 3 or more rotors selected from a set of 5 or 8, depending on the service and model, a plug board that added an additional layer of encryption, and daily key settings that changed the starting positions of rotors and the plug board connections, creating a key space so vast that exhaustive search was mathematically infeasible with contemporary computing capabilities. German cryptographic experts had calculated that even if enemy codebreakers obtained an Enigma machine and understood its mechanical operation, the number of possible daily key settings made decryption without knowledge of those settings effectively impossible. This calculation was mathematically sound. The key space was genuinely enormous, but it rested on assumptions that would prove fatally flawed. That Allied codebreakers would not develop mathematical shortcuts that reduced the effective key space, that Allied forces would not capture key-setting documents that provided starting points for cryptanalysis, that German operators would maintain perfect communications discipline and never make errors that provided cribs or patterns that aided code-breaking efforts, and that Allied industrial capacity would not produce specialized computing machines that could test potential key settings at speeds far exceeding manual calculation. The breaking of Enigma had begun before the war, with Polish mathematicians developing theoretical approaches that treated the cipher as a mathematical problem rather than as an intractable puzzle. Polish cryptanalysts, motivated by geographical proximity to German military power and by recognition that Poland would likely face German aggression, had obtained Enigma machines through intelligence operations and had developed electromechanical devices called bombs that could test potential rotor settings systematically. When Poland was overrun in 1939, Polish codebreakers shared their work with British and French intelligence services, providing the mathematical and mechanical foundations that British efforts at Bletchley Park would build upon. The British code-breaking establishment at Bletchley Park represented an institutional commitment to signals intelligence that was unprecedented in scale and sophistication. The facility employed thousands of personnel ranging from mathematicians and linguists to engineers and clerical workers, all organized into specialized sections that focused on different aspects of German military communications. The process of breaking Enigma was not a single breakthrough, but rather a continuous campaign of incremental advances, developing methods to exploit operator errors, designing improved bomb machines that could test key settings faster, capturing codebooks and key materials from U-boats and weather ships, recruiting personnel with specific skills in mathematics and pattern recognition, and creating institutional procedures that could process intercepted messages and distribute decrypted intelligence to military commanders who could act on it without compromising the source. The integration of American resources into the code-breaking effort after 1941 accelerated progress dramatically. American industrial capacity produced bomb machines in quantities that British industry alone could not manufacture, with companies like NCR, National Cash Register, building over 120 bombs that operated 24 hours daily testing potential Enigma key settings. American cryptanalysts contributed mathematical innovations and brought systematic engineering approaches to problems that British efforts had approached more intuitively. The Anglo-American intelligence partnership created redundancy and specialization that allowed continuous monitoring of German communications, even as the Germans introduced complications like four-rotor Enigma machines for U-boat communications, or more frequent key changes designed to improve security. The intelligence derived from Enigma decrypts, codenamed Ultra by the British, covered virtually every aspect of German military operations: U-boat patrol positions and attack orders, Luftwaffe bombing targets and aircraft deployments, Wehrmacht unit movements and operational plans, supply convoys and logistics operations, even strategic discussions among German high command. The volume and specificity of intelligence that Enigma decryption provided was staggering, offering Allied commanders insights into German intentions and capabilities that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional intelligence methods. But the intelligence was only valuable if it could be exploited without revealing to Germans that their communications were compromised, which required elaborate deception operations and strict discipline about how decrypted intelligence was used operationally. Kapitän-Leutnant Hartmann, finalizing his encoded transmission in the Lorient bunker, represented thousands of German officers who unknowingly participated in this intelligence asymmetry. His trust in Enigma security was absolute, based on authoritative briefings about the cipher's mathematical strength and on the absence of any evidence that Allied forces were systematically reading German communications. When Allied convoys evaded his patrol area, or when Allied aircraft appeared over U-boat positions with suspicious frequency, Hartmann attributed these occurrences to German intelligence failures, to Allied radar capabilities, or to operational bad luck rather than suspecting that Allied forces possessed strategic intelligence about German plans and dispositions. This interpretation was psychologically comfortable and institutionally reinforced. German military culture emphasized operational security and assumed that German cryptographic superiority was an established fact that required no continuous validation. The sound of the Enigma machine, that distinctive clicking as rotors advanced and electrical contacts closed, became for Allied intelligence personnel at Bletchley Park and at American code-breaking facilities a herald of incoming intelligence. Intercepted Enigma transmissions would be recorded, transcribed, and fed into bombs that would test potential key settings until the correct daily keys were identified, at which point the encrypted text could be decrypted and translated. The time required for this process varied depending on the Enigma model, the availability of cribs or known plaintext, and the computational resources available, but by 1943 the process had been streamlined sufficiently that high-priority naval Enigma messages could often be decrypted within hours of interception, providing intelligence that was tactically and operationally current rather than merely historically interesting. The operational impact of ultra-intelligence on the Battle of the Atlantic illustrates how Enigma decryption affected actual combat outcomes. German U-boat operations depended on concentrating submarines along convoy routes, using radio communications to coordinate wolfpack tactics where multiple U-boats would attack a single convoy in overwhelming force. These radio communications, all encrypted with Enigma, provided Allied naval intelligence with precise information about U-boat positions, patrol areas, and attack plans. Allied convoy routing authorities could use this intelligence to steer convoys around known U-boat concentrations, could position escort forces to protect convoys that could not be rerouted, and could direct anti-submarine forces to areas where U-boats were known to be operating. The result was a dramatic shift in the Atlantic battle's dynamics. U-boat success rates declined, Allied shipping losses decreased, and German naval commanders struggled to understand why tactics that had been effective early in the war were failing by 1943. From Hartmann's perspective, and from the perspective of U-boat crews throughout the Atlantic, this shift was baffling and demoralizing. Patrols that intelligence had predicted would intercept vulnerable convoys instead found empty ocean. Allied escorts appeared to know exactly where to search for U-boats, delivering depth charge attacks with an accuracy that seemed to exceed what radar and sonar alone could explain. Aircraft patrols found U-boats with a frequency that statistical analysis suggested was improbable. The explanations that German naval intelligence developed for these patterns focused on improved Allied detection technology, radar that could locate submarines on the surface, direction-finding equipment that could track U-boat radio transmissions, perhaps even new sonar capabilities that extended detection ranges. These explanations were partially correct. Allied detection technology did improve substantially during the war, but they missed the fundamental reality that Allied forces were reading German operational orders and using that intelligence to position forces advantageously before U-boats even reached their patrol areas. The institutional mechanisms that prevented German forces from recognizing Enigma's compromise were multiple and reinforcing. German signals intelligence services, primarily the B-Dienst, had achieved their own successes against Allied naval codes and could demonstrate that German code-breaking was sophisticated and effective, which reinforced confidence that German codes were similarly secure. German cryptographic experts periodically reviewed Enigma's security and consistently concluded that the cipher remained unbroken because they could not conceive of the industrial-scale code-breaking operation that Bletchley Park and American facilities represented. German military culture emphasized operational security as an individual and unit responsibility, meaning that when operations failed or when Allied responses suggested foreknowledge, the assumption was that security breaches occurred through espionage, through careless communications, or through operational predictability rather than through systematic cryptanalytic success. Perhaps most importantly, Allied operational security around ultra-intelligence was extraordinarily disciplined. Military commanders who received ultra-derived intelligence were not told the source, were required to establish plausible, alternative explanations for actions based on that intelligence, and were forbidden from taking actions that would make it obvious to Germans that their communications were being read. This meant that sometimes valuable intelligence could not be exploited if doing so would risk compromising the source. Convoys could be rerouted based on reconnaissance aircraft sightings of U-boat concentrations. Anti-submarine operations could be initiated based on direction-finding bearings on U-boat radio transmissions. German facilities could be bombed based on photographic reconnaissance that revealed their importance. These cover stories were elaborate and consistently maintained, creating plausible explanations for Allied successes that did not require German analysts to conclude that Enigma was compromised. The transformation in Allied fortunes that ultra-intelligence enabled was gradual and difficult to attribute to any single factor, which itself helped conceal the intelligence source. The Battle of the Atlantic did not shift suddenly in Allied favor, but rather improved incrementally over months as ultra-intelligence became more available and as Allied forces developed tactics and procedures for exploiting that intelligence effectively. German analysts could attribute this shift to multiple factors: increased Allied escort vessel availability, improved Allied aircraft coverage, better Allied detection technology, declining German U-boat crew quality as experienced submariners were lost and replaced by less trained personnel, perhaps even declining German operational security as communication protocols became lax under operational pressure. The explanation that Allied forces were systematically reading German naval communications in near real time seemed so improbable, given Enigma's mathematical complexity, that serious consideration of this possibility was easily dismissed. Hartmann's patrol in U-653 exemplified the operational futility that Enigma compromise created for German forces. His orders directed him to a specific patrol area based on German intelligence about Allied convoy routing. But Allied naval intelligence having read his orders, rerouted the convoy he was supposed to intercept, adding perhaps a day to the convoy's transit time, but ensuring it would not pass through Hartmann's patrol zone. Hartmann waited at his assigned position, maintaining radio silence as ordered, conserving fuel and torpedoes, scanning empty horizons for targets that would never appear. After days of fruitless patrolling, he would report no contact, receive orders redirecting him to a different area, and begin the cycle again, never understanding that the fundamental assumption underlying U-boat operations, that German patrol positions were secret until U-boats made contact with enemy forces, was false, because Allied intelligence knew where German U-boats were positioned before those U-boats even reached their patrol areas. The psychological impact of this invisible intelligence asymmetry on German military effectiveness extended beyond the immediate operational consequences. German forces fought the entire war under the assumption that their communications security was adequate, that their operational plans were secret until executed, and that Allied responses to German operations reflected conventional intelligence and tactical competence rather than strategic foreknowledge. This assumption meant that German operational planning did not account for the possibility that Allied forces might know German plans in advance, did not develop deception operations designed to mislead enemy intelligence about German intentions, and did not create the kind of systematic operational security culture that would have been necessary if Germans had understood that their most secure cipher system was fundamentally compromised. The sound of Enigma machines clicking throughout German military headquarters and command posts represented not security, but rather a systematic intelligence vulnerability that Germans never recognized. Each encoded message was a window into German plans and intentions. Each transmission was a data point that Allied codebreakers could decrypt and analyze, and the cumulative effect was that German forces operated with a level of transparency that would have seemed impossible to German commanders who trusted in Enigma's mathematical security. The clicking was the acoustic signature of institutional failure, the failure to question assumptions about cipher security, the failure to recognize patterns in Allied responses that suggested systematic intelligence compromise, the failure to develop alternative explanations when the explanation of Allied foreknowledge would have been more accurate than the explanations German intelligence services actually developed. Allied commanders who received ultra-intelligence understood the extraordinary advantage it provided and the necessity of protecting the source at almost any cost. Churchill reportedly said that Ultra was the secret weapon that won the war, though he ensured that this secret remained protected for decades after war's end. Eisenhower and other senior commanders structured operations to exploit Ultra while maintaining plausible alternative explanations for their intelligence. Naval commanders rerouted convoys based on reconnaissance reports of U-boat positions. Ground commanders positioned forces to counter German offensives based on prisoner interrogations that revealed German plans. Air commanders targeted German facilities based on photographic intelligence that identified their importance. The systematic deception required to protect Ultra's security was almost as elaborate as the code-breaking operations themselves, requiring constant vigilance and occasional sacrifices where valuable intelligence could not be used because exploitation would have revealed the source. The institutional discipline that maintained Ultra's secrecy extended into the post-war period, with the British government classifying all information about Enigma decryption until the 1970s, nearly 3 decades after war's end. This extended secrecy reflected both legitimate concerns about protecting cryptanalytic methods that remained relevant in the Cold War and recognition that revealing the systematic penetration of German military communications would have been embarrassing to surviving German military leaders who had never suspected that their most secure cipher had been broken. When the ultra-secret finally became public through historical scholarship and official declassification, German veterans expressed shock and incomprehension. The revelation challenged their understanding of the war, forced reevaluation of operational decisions and outcomes they had attributed to other factors, and demonstrated that the technological and mathematical superiority they had assumed Germany possessed was actually a vulnerability that Allied industrial capacity and institutional competence had systematically exploited. The symbolic significance of the Enigma machine's clicking sound extends beyond its immediate intelligence implications to represent broader themes about technological confidence, institutional blindness, and the relationship between mathematical security and practical cryptanalysis. German confidence in Enigma was not stupid or irrational. The cipher was mathematically complex and would have been secure against the theoretical attacks that German cryptographers could conceive. But the confidence became a vulnerability when it prevented serious consideration that Allied forces might have developed cryptanalytic approaches that German theory had not anticipated, that Allied industrial capacity could produce computing machines that automated decryption at scales German experts had not imagined possible, or that Allied intelligence discipline could maintain the secrecy of a major intelligence source despite years of exploitation that produced evidence of systematic penetration. For German military personnel who survived the war and learned decades later about Ultra's existence, the revelation produced complex emotional responses: anger at having been deceived about German security, recognition that many operational failures they had attributed to other causes were actually the result of Allied intelligence advantages, and a certain bitter admiration for the Allied success in maintaining the secret despite the massive scale of the code-breaking operation. Some German veterans disputed the significance of ultra-intelligence, arguing that German defeat was inevitable due to material and industrial disparities regardless of intelligence advantages. Others acknowledged that Ultra probably shortened the war by months or years, preventing German forces from achieving tactical surprises that might have prolonged the conflict, and providing Allied forces with intelligence that saved lives by enabling more effective military operations. The technical details of how Enigma was broken and how ultra-intelligence was exploited remained subjects of historical research and public fascination for decades after the war. With scholars documenting the mathematical innovations, the engineering achievements, the institutional organizations, and the operational procedures that made systematic Enigma decryption possible. The Polish contribution, the initial mathematical breakthroughs that made theoretical decryption possible, was finally recognized after being overlooked in early accounts that focused primarily on British efforts. The role of American industrial capacity in producing bomb machines and in contributing cryptanalytic personnel was documented as part of the broader Anglo-American intelligence partnership that characterized the Allied war effort. The individual stories of Codebreakers, from Alan Turing's theoretical contributions to the thousands of mostly female personnel who operated bombs and performed the clerical work that made industrial-scale code-breaking possible, gradually emerged from classification and became part of World War II's historical narrative. The clicking of Enigma machines in German military headquarters throughout the war was ultimately the sound of strategic illusion, the belief that technological sophistication and mathematical complexity could provide security against enemies who possessed the industrial resources, the institutional commitment, and the mathematical creativity to systematically defeat those protections. The sound represented German confidence that was misplaced, German assumptions that were false, and German operational security that was an illusion maintained only by Allied discipline in concealing how they obtained intelligence that shaped virtually every major military operation from 1941 through war's end. Each click announced to those who understood its significance that German forces were transmitting information that Allied intelligence would exploit, that German operational plans were becoming Allied operational intelligence, and that the advantage of secrecy that military forces throughout history had valued above nearly all other advantages had been systematically negated through a combination of mathematical brilliance, industrial capacity, and institutional excellence that German military culture had not anticipated and never recognized, despite 3 years of evidence that should have raised fundamental questions about German communication security. When Kapitänleutnant Hartmann's U-boat departed Lorient for its patrol in March 1943, when it navigated through the Bay of Biscay under cover of darkness to avoid Allied aircraft, when it reached its assigned patrol area and began scanning for convoys that intelligence had predicted would pass nearby, the submarine and its crew operated under the assumption that German operational planning had provided them with advantages of position and surprise. The reality was that Allied naval intelligence had read Hartmann's orders before U-653 cleared the harbor, that convoy routing authorities had already diverted Allied shipping around the patrol area where Hartmann waited, and that the advantage of surprise was entirely Allied. They knew where German U-boats were positioned, while German submariners believed their positions were secret. This inversion of the expected intelligence relationship was so complete and so sustained that it calls into question how Germans could have failed to recognize it, how institutional confidence in Enigma's security could have persisted despite mounting evidence that Allied responses suggested systematic penetration of German communications. The answer lies partly in the elaborate Allied deception operations that provided plausible, alternative explanations for intelligence-driven successes, partly in German institutional biases that made questioning Enigma's security uncomfortable and politically fraught, and partly in the simple reality that the scale of the Allied code-breaking operation exceeded what German military culture conceived as possible. The idea that thousands of Allied personnel were working continuously to break German codes, that industrial production lines were manufacturing specialized computing machines whose sole purpose was automated cryptanalysis, that the entire apparatus was security compartmented and disciplined enough that no significant leaks revealed its existence despite years of operations. All of this suggested an institutional competence and resource commitment that German military culture had difficulty accepting as realistic. The epilogue of the Enigma story is that the clicking of those machines, which sounded thousands of times daily throughout the German military establishment, was ultimately the acoustic signature of Allied victory. Not because Enigma decryption alone won the war, but because it exemplified the systematic advantages that characterized Allied war-making, the ability to mobilize scientific and mathematical expertise, the industrial capacity to produce specialized equipment at scale, the institutional discipline to maintain operational security around sensitive sources, and the strategic patience to exploit advantages systematically over extended periods rather than seeking immediate dramatic results that might compromise long-term capabilities. The sound of Enigma encoding German messages was also the sound of Allied intelligence receiving those messages, and Allied commanders reading German plans and Allied forces positioning to counter German operations before those operations were executed. 4. German soldiers and sailors who fought throughout the war, never knowing that their most secure communications were systematically compromised, the revelation decades later forced recognition that many of their experiences, the convoys that evaded U-boat patrols, the Allied forces that appeared where intelligence said they shouldn't be, the tactical surprises that German planning had not anticipated, were not the product of German intelligence failures or Allied tactical luck, but rather the systematic exploitation of an intelligence advantage so fundamental and so completely maintained that German military forces fought the entire war under a strategic blindness they never recognized. The clicking of Enigma machines was the sound of that blindness, the mechanical rhythm that announced Germany's confidence in protections that had already been penetrated, the acoustic signature of a technological advantage that was actually a systematic vulnerability that Allied forces exploited with devastating effectiveness until the very end of the conflict.